I am Vitaly Portnikov. The United States has struck Iran's nuclear facilities in Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. Thus, Donald Trump made a significant decision regarding the involvement of the United States in the ongoing war, a conflict that began after a series of Israeli attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities and continues with ongoing exchanges of missile strikes between Iran and Israel. From the very first days of this war, it was emphasized that Israel is unlikely to be able to put an end to Iran's attempts to gain access to nuclear weapons on its own without the help of the United States. The discussion was primarily about the Fordo nuclear facility, which is so well protected that only bunker-busting bombs, which are in the arsenal of the United States Armed Forces, can destroy this site. And only the United States has aircraft capable of carrying such bombs in service. At the same time, officials in Tehran claimed that the Fordo facility did not sustain any significant damage, and they are threatening the United States with retaliation for their attacks. How truthful the information from Tehran is, and to what extent Tehran has actually lost access to the capability to develop nuclear weapons, can only be determined over time. It should not be forgotten that, in addition to its own nuclear reactors, Iran has an option that, for some inexplicable reason, is overlooked both in Washington and in Jerusalem. This option lies in the assistance that the Russians and the Chinese can provide to Iran, in such a way that it would appear as though Iran had produced its own nuclear weapons. Russian President Putin has already emphasized that Iran's underground facilities did not suffer any damage after attacks by Israel. Iran itself stresses that its facilities were not damaged after attacks by the United States. Now, of course, we will have to wait for comments from Moscow, but we understand this. If both Iran and Russia emphasize that there was no damage to the underground facilities, even if they are lying, both countries still have the opportunity to come to an agreement about providing nuclear weapons to Iran, and then explain the appearance of these weapons not as assistance from the Russian Federation, but as the result of the Islamic Republic's own production activities. And it is precisely this course of events that we are approaching. But at the same time, the most important thing is what response Iran will choose after the United States attacks its nuclear facilities. Will Tehran decide to carry out its long-standing threat and attack American bases in the Middle East, or, through as yet unknown operations, target American facilities within the United States itself? After Ukraine's web operation and the Israeli Special Forces operation on Iranian soil, we understand that such attacks on American territory itself are no longer just science fiction. All the more so if we take into account the terrorist activity of organizations linked to Iran and that country's reliance on so-called proxy armies. The Yemeni Houthis have already announced that they are withdrawing from the agreements that the United States reached with the terrorist organization Ansar Allah, and thus may carry out attacks on American targets in the coming hours and days. Will Iran also be ready to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, thereby calling into question the possibilities of energy trade? This is also an option that will obviously be considered in the coming hours and days. In the United States itself, the days immediately following Washington's attack on Iranian nuclear reactors are considered the most dangerous. We're talking even about the next 48 hours. But what actions the United States will take in response to any Iranian retaliation is also something no one knows right now. it is clear that Donald Trump wanted the American attack to be targeted and to put an end to Iran's nuclear program, and for Iran itself to return to the negotiating table and sign exactly the agreement that Trump had insisted on from his very first days back in the Oval Office. An agreement that does not allow uranium enrichment in Iran, an agreement that the leadership of the Islamic Republic categorically refused, as they were determined to create a nuclear bomb and destroy the state of Israel. In the first hours after the Americans carried out their attack, Iranian attacks on Israel not only did not stop, but even intensified. And perhaps this could also be Iran's tactic in response to the American attacks, to increase attacks on Israel and demonstrate that Iran is determined to inflict as much damage as possible, specifically on the Jewish state, but without creating circumstances in which President Trump might decide to launch new American attacks on Iran. So far, there has been no serious diplomatic response either from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation or from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China. Iranian media, of course, will now be turning to Moscow and Beijing, but so far, condemnation of the actions of the United States can only be seen from the countries of the so-called Global South, primarily Saudi Arabia and Iraq. However, these condemnations are primarily declarative in nature and are unlikely to affect these countries' relations with Washington. It is clear that Saudi Arabia, on the one hand, is itself interested in ensuring that Iran does not have access to nuclear weapons, but on the other hand, the country's leadership must take into account the interests of its own population, which is hostile both toward Iran and toward the United States and Israel. And thus, the allies of the United States in the Middle East do not have many options when it comes to responding to American actions. It is also worth emphasizing that the mood within American society itself will play a significant role. As is known, Donald Trump's desire to join the Israeli attacks on Iran has already caused a serious rift among his own supporters. Some of them called on the President of the United States to eliminate the Iranian nuclear threat, while others reminded Donald Trump that he had promised not to drag the United States into new wars. And now much will depend on how events unfold. If the United States is indeed forced to become continuously involved in the escalation, or if American servicemen are killed as a result of Iranian or Yemeni attacks, this will change both these people's attitude toward Donald Trump and his very foreign policy concept. This has happened repeatedly in the history of the United States, when a president who promised not to involve the United States in new wars ended up becoming someone forced to wage these wars due to objective circumstances. However, among his supporters, there was never an understanding that these were objective circumstances and that the United States had an objective role to play in the world. It will also be important what consequences for the Russian-Ukrainian war will be associated with American intervention in the war between Israel and Iran. The United States strikes on Iran took place just on the eve of the NATO summit in The Hague, where President Donald Trump is set to discuss further cooperation between the United States and its European allies with the leaders of NATO member countries. A meeting between the American president and the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, is also possible at the summit. And we all understand perfectly well that these contacts will take place in a new atmosphere, shaped by Russia's reaction to the American strikes, as well as by the further unpredictable developments that, one way or another, are leading down the road to World War III. And here I think few people actually doubt that we are on this path and not on some other one. If Russia reacts negatively to the American operation in Iran and helps Tehran withstand the difficult confrontation with Washington and Jerusalem, this could change the attitude of the President of the United States toward the Russian leader and thus help him make a decision about further supporting Ukraine in the next phase of the Russian-Ukrainian standoff. And here we are talking both about providing our country with military weapons and about financial assistance to Ukraine in the next phase of the war. But we understand that if the conflict in the Middle East escalates and requires new weapons, both for the US military itself and for the Israeli army, this could raise logistical questions. Are there enough arsenals to supply weapons for a large, almost global war? Another important aspect is Trump's political attitude toward Putin. Will the American president continue to persuade his Russian counterpart to end the war in Ukraine and then look for opportunities to establish peace? Will he understand that Putin is not inclined towards such decisions and that the only way to force the Russian president to end this war is through pressure on the person whom Trump would consider an ally of the Iran he so despises? But we perfectly understand that there are no answers to this question. But Putin, on the other hand, may believe that American strikes on Iran legitimize his own actions in Ukraine and justify further strikes on our territory with the aim of eliminating military targets that Putin will consider dangerous to his own country. It was absolutely no coincidence that the Russian president spoke at his plenary session at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum about the Ukrainian dirty bomb. The Russian leader may link further strikes on Ukraine precisely to the fact that he is acting in the same way Trump acted in Iran. And just as Trump wanted to rid humanity of Iran's nuclear program, Putin wants to protect his country from a possible strike by a Ukrainian dirty bomb, which is allegedly being produced at the military enterprises of our state. And although, as we understand, Putin will not provide any evidence for this information, he will use this imitation of American tactics to justify further attacks on Ukraine. And in this way, he will explain his unwillingness to end the Russian-Ukrainian war until Russia is convinced of its own security. And Russia's security obviously means the establishment of a puppet pro-Russian regime in Ukraine. So today, in the first hours after the American attack on Iran, there are more questions than answers. But that's always the case when the situation changes rapidly and turns into a scenario of global threat. As always happens in such cases, a global threat can literally turn into a regional conflict within a few hours or days, with the participants negotiating a truce among themselves, or it can escalate into a conflict involving new parties and new staggering casualties. Everything, as I said, will depend on the responses of the axis of evil countries to the American attack, on their willingness to strike American targets, or on their readiness to negotiate with the Americans. But how Ayatollah Khomeini and the representatives of Iran's top political and military leadership will act is quite difficult to predict at this moment, if only because these people demonstrated intransigence literally just a few hours before the American attack. I am referring to the negotiations between Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and the foreign ministers of European countries, fully aware of the possibility of such actions from Donald Trump, and it is unlikely that the American attack itself convinced Ayatollah Khomeini and other Iranian leaders of the need to act more prudently and constructively in negotiations with Washington, which up to this point had been nothing more than an attempt to buy time to acquire nuclear weapons sandwich to both the Iranian leadership and its allies in Russia and China can hardly seem like anything other than a way to justify their own efforts to obtain nuclear weapons through diplomatic dialogue with America. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to it, follow me on my social media and on my Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee and Donatello channels, which help support the development of these projects. Make use of the sponsorship feature right here on YouTube. Victory and peace. Good luck.